What happens when a corporate bully picks the wrong target? Sarah Martinez looked like any other office worker in her crisp business suit. But beneath her calm exterior lay years of Navy SEAL training that had shaped her into one of the most lethal protectors the military had ever produced. When she witnessed harassment against the most vulnerable employee in the building, she made a choice that would expose not just her true identity, but the real character of everyone around her. Some battles aren't fought with weapons. They're won with courage. And this is the story of how one woman's quiet strength changed everything. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridors of Morrison Financial Group, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mirror the cold atmosphere that had settled over the 15th floor. Sarah Martinez walked purposefully down the hallway, her low heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another mid-level executive heading to another mundane meeting, her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, her navy blazer perfectly pressed, and her expression pleasantly neutral. But Sarah was different from everyone else in that building in ways they could never imagine. At 32, she had already lived 3 lifetimes. The first was her childhood in a small Texas town where her father taught her that strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The second was her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, serving in some of the most dangerous theaters of operation around the world, where she learned that true power came from restraint and that the deadliest warriors often looked the least threatening. The third was this new life, corporate America, where she was trying to blend in, to be normal, to use her strategic mind for spreadsheets instead of survival. As she turned the corner near the executive conference room, she heard something that made her pause. It wasn't the words themselves that caught her attention. She'd heard worse language in military barracks, but the tone, the cruel laughter that followed, the sound of someone being deliberately humiliated. "Look at this mess, you worthless piece of trash," came a voice she recognized immediately. Derek Morrison, the CEO's nephew, whose claim to his position had more to do with his last name than his qualifications. "I told you to have this conference room spotless by 8, and look at this pathetic job you've done." Sarah moved closer to the partially open door, her training automatically kicking in as she assessed the situation. Through the gap, she could see Derek standing over Miguel Santos, the night janitor who had been with the company for over 15 years. Miguel was probably in his late 50s, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he tried to clean coffee stains from the mahogany table that Derek had clearly just spilled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison," Miguel said quietly, his accent thick with nervous tension. "I clean it again, right now. You'll clean it again, and again, until you get it right," Derek sneered, deliberately knocking over a cup of coffee that splashed across the papers Miguel had just organized. "And maybe next time you'll remember that some of us have real jobs that matter." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the military, she had learned to read people quickly, to assess threats and allies in seconds. Derek Morrison was the worst kind of bully, someone who used his position to target those who couldn't fight back. Miguel, she could see, was trapped. He needed this job, probably had a family depending on him, and couldn't afford to lose it by standing up to the boss's nephew. But Sarah could. Derek was still berating Miguel when Sarah stepped into the room. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through Derek's tirade. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Derek turned, his face flushed with the kind of anger that came from being caught in the act. He was tall and broad, probably thought his physical presence intimidated people. Sarah had faced down enemy combatants and terrorists. A corporate bully in an expensive suit wasn't going to rattle her. "Sarah, right?" Derek said, try to regain his composure. "This doesn't concern you. Just some housekeeping issues." Sarah looked at Miguel, who was frantically trying to clean up the deliberately spilled coffee, his movements quick and fearful. Then she looked back at Derek, her expression remaining perfectly professional. "It looks like there's been an accident. Miguel, why don't you let me help you with that?" Before Derek could protest, Sarah moved to the supply cabinet and retrieved some paper towels. She knelt beside Miguel, ignoring the expensive fabric of her skirt as she began helping him clean up the mess. The older man looked at her with surprise and gratitude, but also worry, clearly afraid that her kindness might make things worse for him later. "What are you doing?" Derek demanded, his voice rising. "He's paid to clean up messes, not you." Sarah continued cleaning, her movements efficient and deliberate. "I'm helping a colleague," she said simply. "Miguel works hard to keep this place running smoothly. The least we can do is treat him with respect." Derek's face darkened. Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was used to people either cowering before his authority or kissing up to him because of his family connections. Her calm defiance was something new, something that threatened the power dynamic he relied on. "Listen here," Derek said, stepping closer, using his height to try to intimidate her. "I don't know who you think you are, but in this company, there's a hierarchy. You do well to remember your place." Sarah stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. Years of combat training had taught her that the most effective warriors never looked like warriors until the moment they needed to. She met Derek's gaze directly, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. "My place," she said quietly, "is helping when I see someone being treated unfairly." The room fell silent. Miguel had stopped cleaning, sensing the tension, but not understanding its full implications. Derek's breathing had quickened slightly. Sarah's psychological training allowed her to read the micro-expressions on his face, the way his pupils dilated slightly, the tension in his jaw. He was feeling challenged, threatened, and his next move would be to try to reassert dominance. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Derek said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "I could have you fired with a phone call." Sarah tilted her head slightly, a gesture that might have seemed casual to an observer, but was actually a positioning technique she'd learned in close-quarters combat training. "That's interesting," she said mildly. "And you think that threats should make me stop helping Miguel?" Derek's face flushed red. He wasn't used to his intimidation tactics failing so completely. "I think you should know that I don't tolerate insubordination. From anyone." "Good thing I'm not being insubordinate then," Sarah replied, her tone remaining perfectly professional. "I'm simply treating a fellow human being with basic decency. I thought that was company policy." Miguel had quietly finished cleaning and was backing toward the door, clearly wanting to escape before the situation escalated further. Sarah caught his eye and gave him a slight nod, permission to leave, though she knew Derek would likely take his frustration out on the janitor later if she didn't handle this properly. "Miguel," she called out as he reached the door. "Thank you for all your hard work keeping this place clean. It doesn't go unnoticed." The older man's face brightened slightly, and he nodded gratefully before hurrying out. Sarah turned back to Derek, who was practically vibrating with anger. "You just made a very big mistake," Derek said, his voice tight with control. "I'm going to make sure you regret interfering in my business." Sarah studied him for a moment, her training automatically cataloging his weaknesses, the way he shifted his weight when angry, the telltale signs of someone who relied on position rather than actual strength, the underlying insecurity that drove his need to bully others. In another life, in another context, he would have been neutralized in seconds. But this wasn't a battlefield, and she wasn't a soldier anymore. She was just Sarah Martinez, trying to navigate the complex social dynamics of corporate America while staying true to the values that had been drilled into her during her years of service. "I don't think I made a mistake," she said finally. "I think I did what anyone with basic human decency should do. If that's a problem for you, then maybe we have different ideas about what this company should stand for." Derek took a step closer, clearly trying to use his physical presence to intimidate her. Sarah didn't move, didn't even blink. She had faced down armed enemies in hostile territory. A corporate bully wasn't going to make her flinch. "You have no idea what kind of power I have in this company," Derek hissed. "My uncle built this place from nothing. I could destroy your career with a single conversation." Sarah considered this for a moment. She thought about her carefully constructed new life, her attempts to blend in and be normal. She thought about her apartment, her routine, her efforts to build something stable and peaceful after years of chaos and violence. But then she thought about Miguel, hurrying away with his shoulders hunched in defeat, afraid and alone. "You know what?" she said, her voice still calm, but with an edge of steel that Derek didn't quite recognize. "I think there are more important things than career advancement." Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the conference room walls. "Like what?" "Standing up for some janitor who probably doesn't even speak proper English." That was the line. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a cold anger that she kept carefully controlled but that Derek had just awakened. In her SEAL training, she had learned to compartmentalize emotions, to use anger as a tool rather than letting it control her. But this casual racism, this dehumanizing dismissal of someone's worth based on their accent or their job, this was exactly the kind of evil she had spent years fighting against. "Miguel has been with this company for 15 years, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He has 3 children, 2 of whom are in college. He speaks 4 languages fluently, volunteers at his church, and works 2 jobs to support his family. He's a better man than you'll ever be, regardless of his accent or his job title." Derek's eyes narrowed. "How do you know all that?" "Because I took the time to talk to him like a human being instead of treating him like furniture," Sarah replied. "You might try it sometime." The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. Derek was clearly trying to process this new information, to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had slipped away from him. Sarah could practically see the wheels turning in his head, the desperate search for a new angle of attack. "Well," Derek said finally, his voice dripping with false pleasantry, "aren't you just a regular saint? Tell me, Saint Sarah, what exactly do you do around here, besides sticking your nose where it doesn't belong?" Sarah straightened slightly. "I'm a strategic consultant. I analyze operational efficiency and identify areas for improvement." Derek's smile was predatory. "Strategic consultant. That's cute. Let me give you some strategic advice. Stay out of my way, keep your mouth shut, and maybe you'll last long enough to see your next performance review." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "And let me give you some advice in return. Treating employees with respect isn't just good for morale, it's good for business. Happy employees are more productive, more loyal, and less likely to file complaints with HR." Derek's face flushed again. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Sarah replied smoothly, "though I understand the difference might not be immediately apparent." For a moment, Derek looked like he might actually lose control entirely. His hands clenched into fists, his breathing became shallow, and Sarah could see him struggling with the urge to do something physically aggressive. Part of her, the part that had been trained to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently, almost hoped he would try something. It would make everything so much simpler. But Derek managed to regain control, though just barely. "This conversation is over," he said through gritted teeth. "But this isn't finished. Not by a long shot." He stormed out of the conference room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had blown her cover, in a way. Not her real identity, that was still safe, but her carefully constructed persona of the quiet, unassuming corporate employee who just wanted to blend in and avoid conflict. But as she thought about Miguel's grateful expression, about the fear in his eyes when Derek was berating him, she knew she would make the same choice again. Some things were more important than maintaining a low profile. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Miguel was probably worrying about his job, about how Derek might retaliate, about whether his attempt to support his family was now in jeopardy because someone had stood up for him. And somewhere else, Derek was likely plotting his revenge, trying to figure out how to make both Sarah and Miguel pay for the humiliation he had just experienced. But Sarah had faced worse enemies than Derek Morrison, and she had always found a way to win. The difference was that this time, the battlefield was a corporate office instead of a foreign desert, and her weapons were words and strategy instead of firearms and explosives. As she prepared to leave the conference room, Sarah made a mental note to learn more about Derek's position in the company, his weaknesses, his patterns. If he wanted a fight, she would give him one. But it would be fought on her terms, using rules he didn't even know existed. The war between Sarah Martinez and Derek Morrison had just begun, and Derek had no idea what kind of enemy he had just made. But he was about to find out. Sarah walked back to her office, her mind already working on multiple levels, analyzing the situation from every angle. She had revealed more of herself than she intended, but sometimes that was the price of doing what was right. And in her experience, the price of doing nothing was always higher. The fluorescent lights continued to hum overhead, casting their harsh shadows on the corporate battlefield below. But now, for the first time in months, Sarah felt truly alive. She had a mission again, a purpose beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports. She was going to protect Miguel Santos, and she was going to teach Derek Morrison a lesson he would never forget. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the conference room, and Sarah could feel the shift in the office atmosphere like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Derek Morrison was planning something. She could see it in the way he moved through the corridors, the hushed conversations that stopped when she appeared, the predatory smile that played at the corners of his mouth whenever their paths crossed. Sarah sat at her desk, ostensibly reviewing quarterly efficiency reports, but her attention was split between the spreadsheet on her screen and the subtle surveillance she was conducting of Derek's activities. Her training had taught her that intelligence gathering was often more valuable than direct confrontation, and she was methodically building a profile of her adversary. Derek Morrison was 28 years old, held an MBA from a prestigious but not particularly challenging university, and had been with Morrison Financial for 3 years, all of it in positions that seemed carefully designed to groom him for eventual leadership despite his obvious lack of qualifications. He drove a red Porsche that probably cost more than Miguel made in 2 years, lived in a penthouse apartment in the city's most expensive district, and had a reputation for expensive tastes and cheap treatment of anyone he considered beneath him. But it was what Sarah had learned about his pattern of behavior that truly concerned her. Through careful observation and casual conversations with other employees, she had discovered that Miguel wasn't Derek's only target. There was Jennifer in accounting, a single mother who Derek frequently joked was too emotional for serious work. There was Marcus in IT, whose stuttered Derek loved to mock during meetings. There was elderly Mrs. Chun from Human Resources, who Derek openly questioned about her retirement plans whenever budget discussions arose. Derek Morrison wasn't just a bully. He was a systematic predator who targeted the vulnerable and used his position to make their lives miserable. And from what Sarah could gather, he had been getting away with it for years because his victims were either too afraid to speak up or too powerless to make their complaints stick. That was about to change. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. She glanced at it and felt her blood run cold. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was unmistakably threatening. You should have minded your own business. Now you're going to pay for interfering. She looked around the office, noting Derek's conspicuous absence from his usual position near the executive suite. Her training kicked in automatically: threat assessment, environmental awareness, potential exit routes. She had received death threats from actual terrorists that concerned her less than this message. Not because Derek was more dangerous than a trained enemy combatant, but because this was supposed to be her safe space, her new life away from violence and conflict. But as Sarah stared at the message, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The familiar calm focus that came with having a clearly defined enemy and a mission to complete. Derek Morrison wanted to play psychological warfare games. He had just challenged someone who had been trained by the best psychological warfare specialists in the world. Sarah saved the message and forwarded it to a secure email account she maintained for situations like this. Then she deleted it from her phone and went back to work, but now with a different kind of focus. Derek had just escalated from workplace harassment to actual intimidation, which meant the rules of engagement had changed. 20 minutes later, she saw Miguel pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway, his movements quick and nervous. When he spotted her, his face brightened slightly, but she could see the worry in his eyes. She caught his attention and nodded toward an empty break room. "Miguel, do you have a moment?" she asked as they stepped into the small room. He nodded, but his expression was apprehensive. Ms. Martinez, I want to thank you for what you did, but I'm worried. Mr. Morrison, he has been asking questions about me, about my family. Sarah felt another surge of cold anger. Threatening her was one thing, but going after Miguel's family crossed a line that even Derek probably didn't realize existed. What kind of questions? About where my children go to school. About my wife's job at the hospital. About where we live. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. He says it's just friendly interest, but his eyes, they're not friendly. Sarah nodded, her mind already working through the implications. Derek was conducting his own intelligence gathering, looking for leverage, for pressure points he could use to control Miguel. It was exactly what a skilled interrogator would do, but Derek was sloppy, obvious about it. He thought he was being clever, but to Sarah's trained eye, his techniques were amateur hour. Miguel, I want you to know that what he's doing is not legal, Sarah said quietly. Intimidating employees, threatening their families, that's harassment, possibly stalking. You don't have to accept it. Miguel shook his head sadly. Ms. Martinez, you don't understand. I need this job. My son, he is in his second year at the university. My daughter, she starts next year. If I lose this job, you're not going to lose your job, Sarah said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even her. Not if I have anything to say about it. Miguel looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. How can you be so sure? He is the boss's nephew. He has power. Sarah studied the older man's weathered face, seeing in it the same dignity and quiet strength she had observed in countless others who had been pushed to their limits, but refused to break. Miguel, power isn't always what it appears to be. Sometimes the people who seem weakest are actually strongest, and sometimes the people who seem powerful are actually very fragile. Before Miguel could respond, the break room door opened and Derek Morrison walked in, his expression switching from predatory satisfaction to theatrical surprise. Well, what do we have here? A secret meeting? Sarah turned to face him, her body language relaxed, but ready. Hello, Derek. Just having a friendly conversation with Miguel about his family. He was telling me about his children's academic achievements. Derek's smile became even more unpleasant. Academic achievements? How touching. Miguel, I was just telling some of the other executives about your situation, about how important it must be for someone in your position to hold on to their job, especially with all those college expenses. The threat was barely veiled, and Sarah could see Miguel shrinking slightly, his shoulders hunching with the weight of implied consequences. But she also saw something else, a flicker of anger in the older man's eyes, quickly suppressed, but definitely present. Miguel Santos might be afraid, but he wasn't broken. That's very considerate of you to take such an interest in Miguel's family, Sarah said pleasantly. I'm sure they appreciate knowing that their father works for such a caring company. Derek's laugh was harsh. Caring. Yes, that's exactly what we are. We care so much about our employees that we want to make sure they're properly motivated to maintain their employment standards. Sarah tilted her head slightly, a gesture that might have seemed casual, but was actually her way of buying time while she calculated her next move. Derek was getting bolder, more obvious about his threats. That suggested either increasing confidence or increasing desperation. And, in her experience, desperate enemies made more mistakes. That's an interesting philosophy, Sarah said. I've always found that employees perform best when they feel secure and valued, not when they're worried about their job security. Have you? Derek stepped closer to Miguel, who instinctively moved back a half step. And what experience do you have with employee management, Sarah? Besides your little strategic consulting position. There was the opening she had been waiting for. Derek was fishing for information about her background, trying to understand what kind of opponent he was dealing with. His intelligence gathering had clearly been as sloppy as his intimidation techniques. Oh, Sarah said with a casual shrug. I've worked in a few high-pressure environments, places where good leadership meant the difference between success and failure, between life and death sometimes. Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. He had caught the implications in her words, but he didn't understand them. Life and death? That seems a little dramatic for corporate consulting. Sarah smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. You'd be surprised how much corporate dynamics resemble other kinds of conflict. The same principles apply. Know your enemy, protect your allies, never underestimate your opponent. Enemy, Derek laughed, but there was a note of uncertainty in it now. This isn't war, Sarah. This is business. Sometimes, Sarah said quietly, they're the same thing. Miguel had been following the conversation with growing confusion and concern. He could sense the underlying tension, the verbal sparring that was happening around him, but he didn't understand the full implications. All he knew was that Sarah was standing up to Derek, and that this confrontation was likely to make things worse for everyone involved. I should go, Miguel said quietly. I have work to finish. Of course you do, Derek said, his attention snapping back to the janitor. Important work, vital work, the kind of work that requires stability. Sarah watched Miguel leave, noting the way his shoulders sagged with the weight of Derek's implied threats. When the door closed behind him, she turned back to Derek, who was looking very pleased with himself. Do you feel better now? She asked. Better about what? About threatening an innocent man to try to get to me. About using someone's children as leverage in whatever game you think you're playing. Derek's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. I was simply showing interest in an employee's well-being. Were you? Sarah moved closer, her movements fluid and controlled. Because it sounded an awful lot like intimidation to me. And intimidation is illegal, Derek. It's harassment, it's creating a hostile work environment, and in some cases it could even be considered stalking. For the first time, Derek looked genuinely uncomfortable. You're being dramatic. A little friendly conversation about family isn't illegal. Friendly conversation, Sarah repeated. Is that what you call asking about where someone's children go to school? About where their wife works? About where they live? That's not friendly conversation, Derek. That's intelligence gathering. And there's only one reason to gather the kind of intelligence about an employee's family. Derek's face flushed, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain control. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Sarah stepped even closer, close enough that Derek could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. Let me tell you what I know. I know that you've been systematically bullying employees who can't fight back for years. I know that you use your family connections to shield yourself from consequences. I know that you target people based on their vulnerability, single mothers, older employees, people with speech impediments, immigrants. Derek's breathing had quickened slightly. I'm not finished, Sarah continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the steel beneath it. I know that you sent me a threatening text message earlier today. I know that you've been asking inappropriate questions about Miguel's family. And I know that you think your last name gives you immunity from consequences. You can't prove any of that, Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah smiled, and this time it was genuinely amused. Derek, I've spent years learning how to gather evidence that would hold up in military tribunals. Corporate HR policies are child's play compared to that. Derek stared at her, and Sarah could see the exact moment when he began to realize that he might be in over his head. His jaw tightened, and she watched him make a decision that she knew he would regret. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. I have resources you can't imagine. Connections. Power. I'm sure you do, Sarah replied mildly. But power is only useful if you know how to use it properly. And intimidating janitors and single mothers isn't exactly what I call strategic thinking. Derek's face went red. This conversation is over. Yes, Sarah agreed. It is. But Derek, the next time you threaten Miguel or his family or anyone else in this company, you're going to discover exactly what kind of resources I have. And I promise you, they're considerably more impressive than yours. Derek stormed out of the break room, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Sarah stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had escalated the conflict deliberately, pushing Derek to reveal more of his hand. And the result had been exactly what she expected. He was sloppy, overconfident, and relied too heavily on his family connections to protect him for consequences. But she had also revealed more of herself than she intended. Her references to military tribunals, to evidence gathering, to resources, Derek was probably trying to parse those comments right now, trying to figure out what they meant. She had maintained her cover, but only barely. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. You think you're smart? You have no idea what's coming. This time, Sarah didn't delete the message. Instead, she screenshot it and forwarded it to her secure email, along with a detailed report of Derek's threats against Miguel and his family. If Derek wanted to play intimidation games, she would be ready. But, more importantly, she would make sure that Miguel and the other vulnerable employees in the company were protected. As Sarah walked back to her office, she found herself thinking about her former commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Torres, who had once told her that the most important battles were the ones you fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. At the time, Sarah had thought she understood what that meant. But now, walking through the sterile corridors of Morrison Financial Group, she realized she was finally beginning to understand the full implications of those words. Derek Morrison thought he was hunting her, but he was wrong. Sarah Martinez was the predator in this scenario, and Derek had just painted a target on himself that he didn't even know existed. The only question now was how long it would take him to realize that he was the one being hunted. The afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows across the corporate battlefield. But for the first time since she had started working at Morrison Financial Group, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The war was just beginning, and Derek Morrison had no idea what he had just unleashed. By the end of the week, Sarah had begun to understand the true scope of Derek Morrison's influence within the company, and, more importantly, the extent of his victims' silent suffering. What had started as a simple act of defending Miguel had evolved into something much larger. A systematic investigation that revealed a pattern of abuse that went far deeper than she had initially suspected. Sarah sat in her office after hours, the building mostly empty except for security guards and the night cleaning crew. On her desk were carefully organized files containing everything she had learned about Derek's behavior over the past several years. The picture that emerged was both disturbing and familiar. Derek Morrison operated like a textbook predator, identifying vulnerable targets and systematically exploiting their weaknesses while using his position to shield himself from consequences. Her investigation had revealed that at least 12 employees had been targets of Derek harassment over the past 3 years. Jennifer Walsh from accounting had been passed over for promotion 3 times after refusing to laugh at Derek's inappropriate jokes during a company party. Marcus Thompson in IT had been publicly humiliated during staff meetings whenever his stutter became pronounced during presentations. Mrs. Chun in HR had been subjected to constant questions about her age and retirement plans, clearly designed to pressure her into leaving. But it was what Sarah had discovered about the company's complaint system that truly angered her. 3 separate employees had filed formal complaints about Derek's behavior with HR, only to have those complaints mysteriously disappear from their files. 2 of those employees had subsequently been let go during restructuring that seemed to target only Derek's critics. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the implications. Derek wasn't just a bully. He was a systematic oppressor who had essentially captured the HR department and was using it as a weapon against his victims. It was a sophisticated operation that suggested either considerable intelligence or experienced coaching from someone who understood corporate power structures. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of her former SEAL teammates, Marcus Rodriguez, who now worked in corporate security consulting. Sarah had reached out to him earlier in the week, ostensibly for advice on office dynamics, but really to get his assessment of Derek Morrison's background. "Checked out your boy Morrison," the message read. "Interesting history. 3 previous companies, similar patterns of complaints that got buried. Also, his uncle Richard isn't just CEO, he's got connections to some very influential people in the financial sector. This might be bigger than you think." Sarah frowned as she processed this information. Derek's pattern of behavior wasn't just tolerated. It was protected at a level that suggested institutional corruption. That changed the dynamics considerably. If Richard Morrison was actively covering for his nephew's behavior, then simply exposing Derek wouldn't be enough. She would need to be prepared for a much larger fight. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on her office door. Sarah looked up to see Miguel standing in the doorway, his cleaning cart beside him, his expression worried and apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you, Ms. Martinez," he said quietly. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did. But I also wanted to ask you to stop." Sarah gestured for him to come in and close the door. "Stop what, Miguel?" "Stop protecting me," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Mr. Morrison, he is making things very difficult. Not just for me, but for other people too. Jennifer in accounting, she told me that he's been asking her questions about you. About what you talk about. He's trying to turn people against you." Sarah nodded. She had expected this. Derek's next logical move would be to try to isolate her by poisoning her relationships with other employees. "What kind of questions is he asking?" "About your background. About why someone like you would care about someone like me. He's telling people that you're probably some kind of troublemaker, that you're trying to cause problems for the company. And what do people think about that?" Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the interesting thing, Ms. Martinez. Most people, they don't believe him. Jennifer, she said that she's been hoping someone would stand up to him for years. Marcus in IT, he said the same thing. Mrs. Chun, she called you an angel." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. Derek had made a crucial strategic error in trying to turn the other employees against her. He had actually revealed how many people had been waiting for someone to challenge him. Instead of isolating Sarah, he had inadvertently identified his victims and potential allies. "Miguel," Sarah said carefully, "how many people has Derek been bothering? Not just recently, but over the years you've been here?" Miguel sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "Many people, Ms. Martinez, but they're all afraid. He is very careful, you know? Never anything that leaves evidence. Always just words, just looks, just making life a little bit harder each day until people either quit or learn to stay invisible. But they talk to each other, the people he targets." "Sometimes," Miguel nodded, "when we think it's safe. In the break room or after work. We share stories. We warn each other about his moods. But nobody ever thought anything could be done about it." Sarah leaned forward, her strategic mind beginning to see the outlines of a plan. "Miguel, would you be willing to help me with something? Something that might help not just you, but everyone Derek has been hurting." Miguel's eyes widened with alarm. "Ms. Martinez, I told you I cannot afford to lose this job." "I understand that," Sarah said gently. "But what if I told you that there might be a way to stop Derek without putting your job at risk? What if there was a way to make sure he could never hurt anyone here again?" Miguel stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the war between hope and fear playing out on his weathered face. "How?" he asked finally. "By doing what he's most afraid of," Sarah replied. "By working together. By making sure his victims aren't isolated and afraid anymore." Over the next hour, Sarah laid out her initial plan. It was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to fight Derek directly, she would build a network of his victims and witnesses. She would help them document his behavior, support each other, and present a unified front that even Derek's family connections couldn't ignore. Miguel listened intently, asking careful questions, his fear gradually being replaced by something Sarah recognized from her military days, the quiet determination of someone who had been pushed too far and was finally ready to push back. "You really think this could work?" he asked when she finished explaining. "I know it will work," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "But I need your help to reach the others. They trust you, Miguel. They'll listen to you in a way they might not listen to me." Miguel was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Jennifer, she stays late on Tuesdays to finish reports. Marcus, he's usually here early on Wednesdays to update the servers. Mrs. Chun, she always eats lunch alone in the small conference room because Derek makes her uncomfortable in the main cafeteria." "Perfect," Sarah said. "We'll start with them. Small groups, casual conversations. No pressure, no demands. Just letting them know that they're not alone and that there are options they might not have considered." As Miguel prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with an expression of concern. "Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How do you know so much about this kind of thing? About fighting powerful people, about building networks, about strategy? You talk like someone who has done this before." Sarah met his gaze steadily. Let's just say I've had some experience dealing with bullies, Miguel. Different kinds of bullies in different places, but the principles are the same. Bullies rely on their victims being isolated and afraid. When those victims come together and support each other, bullies lose their power. Miguel nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring out at the city lights and thinking about what she had just committed to. Building a resistance network in a corporate environment wasn't that different from building one in hostile territory. You needed trust, communication, shared goals, and careful operational security. But there was one crucial difference. In the military, she had been part of an official organization with clear authority and rules of engagement. Here, she was operating on her own, using skills she wasn't supposed to have to fight a battle she wasn't supposed to be fighting. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Derek. Having fun playing hero? Wait until you see what happens to heroes who don't know when to quit. This time, Sarah didn't just save the message. She forwarded it to Marcus Rodriguez with a note. Need full background check on Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Financial Group. Looking for any vulnerabilities, any scandals, any pressure points that might be useful. Within an hour, Marcus had responded with a preliminary report that made Sarah smile for the first time all week. Richard Morrison had his own secrets, his own vulnerabilities, and his own enemies in the financial community. If Derek wanted to escalate this fight, Sarah was prepared to take it to levels he couldn't imagine. But first, she needed to build her network. Over the next few days, Sarah began implementing her plan with the precision and patience that had made her one of the most effective operators in her SEAL unit. She approached each of Derek's victims carefully, building trust, offering support, and gradually introducing the idea that they didn't have to suffer in silence. Jennifer Walsh was the first to fully commit to the cause. During a casual conversation in the break room, she revealed that she had been keeping detailed notes about Derek's harassment for over 2 years, hoping that someday she would have the courage to use them. When Sarah suggested that someday might be sooner than she thought, Jennifer's eyes lit up with a fierce determination that reminded Sarah why she had always preferred fighting alongside people who had been underestimated by their enemies. Marcus Thompson took longer to convince, his natural caution heightened by years of being Derek's favorite target during meetings. But when Sarah mentioned that Derek had been asking questions about his family, Marcus's stutter disappeared entirely, replaced by a clarity of purpose that was both impressive and slightly frightening. Mrs. Chun was the most surprising ally. The elderly HR representative had seemed frail and intimidated, but when Sarah approached her about Derek's behavior, the older woman's eyes hardened with an anger that had been building for decades. I've been working in human resources for 35 years, Mrs. Chun said during a private lunch meeting. I've seen bullies before, but Derek Morrison is something special. He's systematic, patient, and absolutely ruthless. I've been documenting everything, waiting for someone with the courage to use it. Use it how? Sarah asked. Mrs. Chun smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw the steel beneath the gentle exterior. Dear, I may look like someone's grandmother, but I've been fighting workplace discrimination since before Derek Morrison was born. I know exactly how to build a case that even his uncle can't ignore. By the end of the week, Sarah had assembled what she privately thought of as her dirty dozen, 12 employees who had been targeted by Derek and were ready to work together to stop him. Each brought different skills and perspectives to the group. Jennifer had documentation skills and financial knowledge. Marcus had technical expertise and access to company communication systems. Mrs. Chun had institutional knowledge and HR connections outside the company. But it was Miguel who proved to be the most valuable asset. His years of invisibility had allowed him to observe Derek's behavior in unguarded moments, and his relationships with maintenance staff gave him access to information that no one else could gather. More importantly, his quiet dignity and obvious integrity made him a natural leader among the group. The first official meeting of what they jokingly called the Morrison Financial Resistance took place in the small conference room after hours on a Friday evening. Sarah looked around the table at the faces of Derek's former victims, people who had been isolated, afraid, and powerless just days earlier, and felt a familiar pride that she remembered from her military days. "Before we begin," Sarah said, "I want everyone to understand what we're committing to. This isn't just about documenting Derek's behavior or filing complaints. This is about changing the culture of this company. It's about making sure that what happened to each of you never happens to anyone else." Jennifer raised her hand slightly. "What exactly are we planning to do?" Sarah smiled. "We're going to give Derek Morrison exactly what he's been asking for. He wants a fight. We're going to give him a war. But we're going to fight it smart, legal, and with overwhelming force." Mrs. Chun chuckled softly. "I like the sound of that." "Good," Sarah replied. "Because Derek Morrison has no idea what he's unleashed. He thinks he's been fighting a lone troublemaker. He's about to discover that he's been fighting an entire network of people who are tired of being pushed around." As the meeting progressed, Sarah outlined her strategy. Phase 1 involved documentation, gathering evidence of Derek's harassment in a format that would be legally admissible. Phase 2 involved building external support, reaching out to regulatory agencies, employment attorneys, and investigative journalists who specialized in corporate misconduct. Phase 3 involved presenting Derek and his uncle with a choice: reform the company's culture or face very public consequences. "What if they just fire us all?" Marcus asked. "They won't," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "Because by the time we're ready to present our case, firing us will be the worst possible move they could make. It would prove everything we're alleging and expose them to lawsuits they can't afford." Miguel raised his hand. "Ms. Martinez, what if Derek tries to retaliate before we're ready? What if he escalates his threats?" Sarah's expression grew cold. "Then Derek Morrison is going to discover that threatening people I care about is the worst mistake he's ever made in his life." The room fell silent, and Sarah realized she had revealed more of her true nature than she intended. But as she looked around the table at the determined faces of her new allies, she decided that maybe it was time to let Derek know exactly who he was dealing with. After all, he had been the one to escalate the situation. Now he was going to learn what real escalation looked like. The following Monday morning brought the kind of corporate drama that Sarah had been both expecting and preparing for. Derek Morrison had spent the weekend planning what he clearly thought would be his decisive victory, but his strategy revealed exactly the kind of amateur tactical thinking that Sarah had hoped for. She arrived at the office to find her key card deactivated and a security guard waiting by her desk with instructions to escort her to Richard Morrison's office immediately. As she walked through the corridors, Sarah noted the worried glances from her allies and the satisfied smirks from Derek's supporters. It was exactly the kind of public display that Derek would use to send a message to anyone considering challenging his authority. Perfect. Richard Morrison's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. The CEO himself was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of unquestioned authority. He looked up as Sarah entered, his expression politely neutral, but his eyes calculating. Derek was already there, standing beside his uncle's desk like a prosecutor presenting his case. His face showed barely contained triumph, and Sarah could see that he believed this meeting would be the end of his problems. "Ms. Martinez," Richard Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Please have a seat." Sarah settled into the chair across from his desk, her posture relaxed but alert. Years of briefings with military commanders had taught her how to read the power dynamics in rooms like this, and she could see exactly how Derek had framed the situation for his uncle. "Derek has brought some concerning issues to my attention," Richard continued. "Allegations of workplace disruption, harassment of employees, and what he describes as increasingly erratic behavior." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That does sound concerning. Could you be more specific about these allegations?" Derek stepped forward, his confidence growing. "You've been conducting unauthorized meetings with employees, asking inappropriate questions about company policies, and creating a hostile work environment for management personnel." Interesting, Sarah replied. And you have evidence of this? Derek's smile was predatory. I have multiple witness statements, records of your after-hours activities, and documentation of your inappropriate interference in employee disciplinary matters. Sarah leaned back slightly, her expression remaining perfectly calm. I see. And these witness statements, are they from employees who were present during these alleged inappropriate activities? Among others, Derek said, though Sarah caught the slight hesitation in his voice. Richard Morrison cleared his throat. Ms. Martinez, these are serious allegations. Do you have any response to them? Sarah considered her options. She could play this defensively, deny the charges, and try to minimize the damage. That's what Derek was expecting, what he had prepared for. Instead, she decided to do exactly what her SEAL training had taught her to do when faced with an ambush, attack through the ambush. Mr. Morrison, she said, addressing the CEO directly, before I respond to these allegations, I have a question for you. Are you aware that your nephew has been conducting what appears to be systematic harassment of vulnerable employees for several years? The room fell silent. Derek's confident expression faltered, and Richard Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Excuse me, Richard said. I'm referring to a pattern of discriminatory behavior targeting employees based on their ethnicity, age, gender, and perceived vulnerability. I'm talking about threats against employees' families, creation of hostile work environments, and what appears to be retaliation against anyone who attempts to file complaints through proper channels. Derek's face flushed red. That's completely false. You've never what, Derek? Sarah interrupted, her voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge of steel. You've never asked Miguel Santos inappropriate questions about where his children go to school? You've never made jokes about Marcus Thompson's speech impediment during staff meetings? You've never suggested that Mrs. Chan should consider retirement because of her age? Richard Morrison's expression had grown very serious. Ms. Martinez, these are extremely serious allegations. Yes, they are, Sarah agreed. And unlike Derek's accusations against me, I have documentation. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on Richard Morrison's desk. Witness statements from 12 employees detailing Derek's harassment. Documentation of at least 3 formal complaints that disappeared from HR files. Records of employees who were terminated or forced to quit after attempting to report Derek's behavior. And, most importantly, evidence that this pattern has been occurring for years while being systematically covered up. Derek stared at the folder as if it were a bomb, which in many ways it was. This is ridiculous. She's been manipulating employees, coaching them to lie about me. Sarah turned to look at Derek directly. Is it your explanation for Miguel Santos's detailed accounts of your threats against his family? For Jennifer Walsh's documentation of your inappropriate comments during company events? For Mrs. Chen's records of age discrimination? Mrs. Chen, Richard Morrison repeated, his voice sharpening. Derek, please tell me you haven't been harassing Helen Chen. Derek's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Sarah could see the exact moment when he realized that his carefully planned ambush had just been turned against him. Mr. Morrison, Sarah continued, I have to ask, were you aware of your nephew's behavior toward employees? Richard Morrison's face had gone pale. No, I was not. These allegations are the first I've heard of any such behavior. Sarah nodded sympathetically. Understand this must be shocking news. However, I do have evidence that suggests at least some level of institutional knowledge about Derek's actions. She reached into her folder and withdrew another document. This is a copy of an email from Derek to someone in HR, dated 6 months ago, referencing the need to manage employee expectations regarding sensitivity to feedback from management. The context suggests discussion of a complaint that was subsequently buried. Derek made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a choke. You can't have that email. That's confidential company communication. Sarah smiled pleasantly. Actually, Derek, when harassment is involved, confidentiality protections for internal communications become much more limited. especially when those communications suggest a pattern of retaliation against victims. Richard Morrison had been reading through the folder while they spoke, his expression growing darker with each page. When he looked up, his gaze was fixed on his nephew with something approaching disgust. "Derek, is this true? Have you been harassing employees?" "Uncle Richard, you have to understand. She's twisting everything. These people, they're trying to cause trouble for the company. I was just maintaining discipline, making sure standards were upheld." "By threatening a janitor's family?" Richard's voice was ice cold. "By mocking an employee's speech impediment? By suggesting that a 35-year HR veteran should retire because of her age?" Derek's confident facade had completely crumbled. "It wasn't like that. You don't understand what it's like trying to manage these people. They don't respect authority unless you what, Derek?" Sarah asked quietly. "Unless you intimidate them? Unless you make them afraid for their jobs and their families?" Richard Morrison stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Derek, get out of my office. Now." "But Uncle Richard, get out." Derek practically ran from the room, leaving Sarah alone with Richard Morrison. The CEO stood at his window for a long moment, staring out at the city below. "Ms. Martinez," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "How long have you known about this?" "I became aware of Derek's behavior about 2 weeks ago when I witnessed him harassing Miguel Santos. The full scope of the problem became clear as I investigated further." Richard turned back to face her. "And these other employees, they're willing to come forward with their experiences?" "They are, but only if they can be assured that there will be no retaliation and that real changes will be made to prevent this from happening again." Richard Morrison sank back into his chair, looking older than he had when Sarah first entered the room. "I had no idea. 30 years of building this company, of trying to create something I could be proud of, and my own nephew." Sarah could see the genuine pain in his expression, and she felt a flicker of sympathy for the older man. "Mr. Morrison, with respect, the question isn't how this happened. The question is what you're going to do about it." Richard looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Derek didn't operate in a vacuum. HR complaints disappeared. Victims were terminated or pressured to quit. There are systemic issues here that go beyond one individual's bad behavior." Richard was quiet for a long moment, then looked at Sarah with new respect. "You're not just a strategic consultant, are you?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Let's just say I have experience dealing with situations where institutional changes are necessary to prevent abuse of power." "Military?" Sarah nodded slightly. "Among other things." Richard Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "What do you want?" Sarah had been waiting for this moment, had planned for it extensively. "I want Derek removed from any position where he can harm employees. I want a full investigation into how his behavior was covered up, with appropriate consequences for anyone who enabled him. I want new policies and procedures that prevent this from happening again. And I want protections for the employees who were brave enough to come forward. And if I agree to all of that, then this matter can be handled internally, quietly, with minimal damage to the company's reputation." Richard Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "And if I don't agree?" Sarah's expression remained pleasant, but her voice carried the unmistakable weight of absolute certainty. "Then you'll be dealing with federal investigations, employment lawsuits, media attention, and the complete destruction of your company's reputation. Because, Mr. Morrison, what I've shown you today is just the evidence I gathered in 2 weeks. Imagine what a team of federal investigators would find if they spent 2 months looking into this company's employment practices." The silence stretched between them for nearly a minute. Finally, Richard Morrison nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined her terms with the precision of a military strategist negotiating a surrender. Derek would be immediately suspended pending investigation, then terminated with cause. The HR personnel who had covered up complaints would face disciplinary action or termination depending on their level of involvement. New harassment policies would be implemented with independent oversight. Victims would receive appropriate compensation, and guarantees of no retaliation. Most importantly, Sarah herself would be given a new position, Director of Workplace Integrity, with authority to investigate and prevent future incidents of harassment or discrimination. That's quite a promotion for someone who was facing termination this morning, Richard observed. Sarah smiled. Mr. Morrison, you're not just hiring me to fix this specific problem. You're hiring me to make sure problems like this never happen again. And trust me, I'm uniquely qualified for that job. As she prepared to leave, Richard Morrison asked one final question. Ms. Martinez, why didn't you just go to the authorities immediately? Why give us the chance to handle this internally? Sarah considered the question carefully, because sometimes the best way to create lasting change is to give people the opportunity to do the right thing. Derek never had that chance. He was raised in privilege and taught that his position protected him from consequences. But you're different. You built this company, and you still have the power to decide what it stands for. Richard Morrison nodded slowly. I won't forget that you gave me this choice. I hope you won't forget why it was necessary in the first place, Sarah replied. As Sarah walked back through the office toward what would soon be her new workspace, she saw Miguel pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. When he spotted her, his face lit up with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Ms. Martinez, he called out quietly. How did it go? Sarah smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with tactical victory and everything to do with justice served. Miguel, I think you're going to like the changes that are coming to this company. For the first time since she had known him, Miguel Santos stood up straight and smiled without fear. And Sarah knew that all the risks she had taken, all the careful planning and strategic maneuvering, had been worth it for this moment. Derek Morrison had challenged the wrong person at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. And now he was about to learn exactly what happened when someone with Navy SEAL training decided to make the protection of others her personal mission. 6 months after what employees now quietly referred to as the Morrison Reckoning, Sarah Martinez stood in her new corner office watching the morning shift arrive at what was now being called one of the most employee-friendly financial firms in the city. The transformation had been remarkable, but the journey to get there had tested every skill she had learned both in the military and in corporate America. Derek Morrison's termination had been just the beginning. The investigation that followed revealed a network of corruption and enablement that went deeper than anyone had initially suspected. 3 HR managers had been terminated for systematically burying complaints. 2 department heads who had participated in the harassment or turned a blind eye to it found themselves facing disciplinary action. Even some of the company's external legal counsel had been replaced when it became clear they had advised on strategies to silence victims rather than address problems. But the real changes weren't in the personnel moves, they were in the fundamental culture of the organization. Sarah had used her new position as Director of Workplace Integrity to implement systems that would have made her former military commanders proud. Anonymous reporting mechanisms with independent oversight. Regular climate surveys that actually meant something. Training programs that focused on prevention rather than legal compliance. Most importantly, a clear message from the top down that harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power would result in immediate and severe consequences regardless of the perpetrator's position or connections. The morning sun streamed through her windows as Sarah reviewed the latest quarterly report on workplace incidents. The numbers told a remarkable story. Formal complaints were actually up significantly, but that was exactly what she had wanted to see. It meant that employees finally felt safe reporting problems. More importantly, the nature of the complaints had shifted from serious harassment to minor communication issues and misunderstandings, the kind of problems that could be resolved through mediation and training rather than termination and legal action. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Miguel Santos entered carrying his usual morning coffee for her, a tradition that had started as a gesture of gratitude, but had evolved into genuine friendship. Good morning, Ms. Martinez, Miguel said, setting the coffee on her desk. How are things looking today? Sarah smiled. Miguel had changed dramatically over the past 6 months. Gone was the hunched-over, fearful man who had been afraid to make eye contact with management. In his place was someone who stood straight, spoke confidently, and had recently been promoted to head of facilities management, a position that gave him authority over building maintenance, security, and environmental services. Things are looking very good, Miguel. How's your son doing at university? Miguel's face lit up with pride. He made Dean's List again this semester. And Maria, my daughter, she got accepted to the engineering program with a partial scholarship. Sarah felt a warm satisfaction at the knowledge that Miguel's children were thriving, that their father no longer had to live in fear of losing his job for standing up to a bully. But more than that, she was proud of how Miguel had grown into his new role. He had become an advocate for the other support staff, ensuring fair wages and working conditions, and his insights into employee morale had proven invaluable to her work. There's something else, Miguel continued, his expression growing more serious. I want to talk to you about the new hire in accounting. Jennifer thinks there might be some issues. Sarah's attention sharpened immediately. Despite all the changes they had implemented, she knew that vigilance was essential. Corporate cultures didn't change overnight, and there would always be people who tested the boundaries to see if the old ways might still work. What kind of issues? Nothing major yet, Miguel said carefully. But he's been making comments about some of the younger female employees. Nothing actionable, but Jennifer says it reminds her of how things used to be. Sarah nodded, making a mental note to have a conversation with Jennifer Walsh, who had become one of her most trusted allies in identifying potential problems before they escalated. Jennifer's promotion to senior financial analyst had been well-deserved. Her attention to detail and her ability to spot patterns made her invaluable both in her official role and as an informal monitor of office dynamics. I'll look into it, Sarah said. Thanks for bringing it to my attention. After Miguel left, Sarah reflected on how different things had become. In the old system, employees like Miguel would have suffered in silence, while people like Derek Morrison acted with impunity. Now, there was a network of communication and support that allowed problems to be identified and addressed before they became serious. But perhaps the most satisfying change was what had happened to the people who had been Derek's victims. Mrs. Chun had been promoted to senior HR director with a mandate to rebuild the entire human resources department from the ground up. Marcus Thompson had overcome his anxiety about public speaking and was now leading company-wide presentations on cybersecurity awareness. Jennifer Walsh was being considered for a director-level position in the newly created financial ethics department. Each of them had blossomed once they were freed from the constant stress and fear that Derek had imposed on their daily lives. It had been a powerful reminder to Sarah of why her work mattered, not just in preventing harassment, but in creating environments where people could reach their full potential. Her computer chimed with an appointment reminder. In 15 minutes, she had a meeting with Richard Morrison to discuss the company's application for certification as a best places to work organization. It was a designation that would have been impossible just months ago, but which now seemed not only achievable, but inevitable. Richard Morrison had surprised her with how committed he had become to the changes. The revelation about his nephew's behavior had shaken him deeply, but rather than trying to minimize the damage or return to the old ways, he had embraced the transformation completely. He had publicly acknowledged the company's past failures, personally apologized to the victims, and made it clear that the new standards would be maintained regardless of cost or inconvenience. Sarah gathered her materials for the meeting, including a comprehensive report on the Culture Change Initiative and projections for continued improvement. As she walked toward the executive suite, she noted the small but significant changes throughout the office. Employees smiled and made eye contact. Conversations were more relaxed. The tension that had permeated the building for years had dissipated, replaced by something that felt genuinely positive. Richard Morrison's office had been redecorated since the events 6 months ago. Gone were the intimidating power symbols and formal barriers. In their place was a more open, welcoming space that reflected the company's new values. "Sarah," Richard said, standing as she entered, "thank you for making time for this." As they settled into comfortable chairs rather than the formal desk configuration of their first meeting, Richard reviewed her report with obvious satisfaction. "These numbers are remarkable," he said. Employee satisfaction up 40%. Turnover down 60%. Productivity improvements across every department. And all of this while we were implementing major structural changes. Sarah nodded. It turns out that when people feel safe and valued, they do better work. Revolutionary concept, I know. Richard laughed, but his expression grew more serious as he continued. Sarah, I've been thinking about something. The board has been asking about succession planning, about the future leadership of this company. Sarah felt a flicker of concern. Are you considering retirement? Eventually, yes. But that's not what I wanted to discuss. I want to talk about your role in that future. Sarah raised an eyebrow. My role? Richard leaned forward. Sarah, what you've accomplished here goes far beyond fixing a harassment problem. You've fundamentally changed what this company is, what it stands for. The board is impressed, the employees trust you, and the results speak for themselves. Thank you, but I'm not sure I understand where this is going. I want you to consider taking on expanded role. Chief Operating Officer, with a clear path to eventually taking over as CEO when I retire. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer. 6 months ago, she had been a mid-level strategic consultant, trying to maintain a low profile. Now she was being offered the opportunity to run one of the region's largest financial firms. That's unexpected, she said finally. Is it? Richard asked. Sarah, you've demonstrated leadership qualities that most people never develop. You've shown the ability to see problems that others miss, to build coalitions, to implement change in the face of resistance. Those aren't qualities you learn in business school. They're qualities that come from real experience with real consequences. Sarah thought about her journey from small-town Texas to Navy SEAL to corporate executive. Each phase had taught her different skills, different perspectives, but they all shared common themes: protecting others, standing up to bullies, using strength in service of something larger than herself. Richard, can I ask you something? Why are you really offering me this position? Richard was quiet for a moment. Because I've spent 30 years building this company, and I want to leave it in the hands of someone who will protect what we've created here. Someone who understands that business success means nothing if it comes at the expense of human dignity. Sarah felt a familiar sense of mission, the same feeling she had experienced when she decided to defend Miguel Santos all those months ago. What would be expected of me in this role? Continue what you've started. Expand it. Make sure that what happened with Derek never happens again, anywhere in this organization. And eventually, take this company to the next level. Show the business world that doing the right thing isn't just morally correct, it's also profitable. As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about her former SEAL teammates, scattered across the country in various careers and endeavors. Most of them had struggled to find civilian work that felt meaningful, that utilized the skills they had developed in service. She had found something rare, an opportunity to use her training not for destruction, but for protection and positive change. I accept, she said finally, but I have conditions. Richard smiled. I wouldn't expect anything less. What do you need? Over the next hour, in negotiated terms that would have made her military commanders proud. Sarah insisted on maintaining her workplace integrity role, even as she took on broader responsibilities. She demanded resources to expand the culture change initiative throughout the company's other locations. Most importantly, she required a commitment that the new standards would be maintained regardless of economic pressures or competitive challenges. As their meeting concluded, Richard Morrison stood and extended his hand. Welcome to the executive team, Sarah. I think this is going to be an interesting journey. Sarah shook his hand, thinking about all the journeys that had brought her to this moment. Mr. Morrison, I think you're right. That afternoon, Sarah called a meeting with her original allies, the Dirty Dozen, who had stood up to Derek Morrison when doing so required real courage. As they gathered in the conference room where Derek had once humiliated Miguel, Sarah looked around at faces that had been transformed by the experience of fighting back and winning. I have news, she announced. Richard Morrison has offered me a promotion to Chief Operating Officer. The room erupted in applause and congratulations, but Sarah raised her hand for silence. I wanted you all to be the first to know, because none of this would have been possible without your courage. You took risks when you didn't have to. You supported each other when it was dangerous to do so. And you proved that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they work together. Miguel raised his hand. Ms. Martinez, what does this mean for the future? For all of us? Sarah smiled. It means that what we built here is just the beginning. It means that we have the opportunity to show other companies, other industries, that treating people with dignity and respect isn't just the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do. Jennifer Walsh spoke up. What about Derek? Do you ever wonder what happened to him? Sarah had actually kept track of Derek Morrison's post-termination activities through her network of contacts. After being fired from Morrison Financial, he had struggled to find comparable employment. Word of his behavior had spread through the financial industry's professional networks, making him effectively unemployable in any position with authority over others. Last she had heard, he was working as a junior analyst at a small firm where his uncle's name carried no weight and his behavior was closely monitored. Derek is learning that actions have consequences, Sarah said diplomatically. The important thing is that he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt people here. Mrs. Chun nodded approvingly. Good. Some lessons are hard to learn, but they stick better when they're expensive. As the meeting concluded and people began to return to their work, Miguel approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something personal? Of course, Miguel. That first day, when you stood up to Derek, you weren't afraid at all. What? Sarah considered the question carefully. Miguel, I learned a long time ago that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Dignity, respect, the safety of people who can't protect themselves. When I saw Derek hurting you, hurting others, I knew I had to act. But you risked so much. Your job, your career, everything. Sarah looked around the office, at the employees who now worked without fear, at the positive energy that permeated the building, at the tangible proof that change was possible. Miguel, let me tell you something I learned in the military. The biggest risk isn't taking action when something is wrong. The biggest risk is doing nothing and letting evil flourish because you're afraid of the consequences. Miguel nodded slowly. You saved us, you know. All of us. Sarah shook her head. No, Miguel. We saved each other. That's how it's supposed to work. As the workday ended and Sarah prepared to leave for home, she stood at her window one last time, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and orange. In a few months, she would take on even